Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, digital divisions. World Wide Web Foundation President and CEO Adrian Lovett explains why the internet is in danger of splitting. Also this week, Venezuela's health system remains starved of money as an international tug-of-war gets underway for control of a key asset. Plus, Senegal's Money Matters, a West African country famous for a pink lake and a strong musical heritage, why its currency has now become an election issue. In a bid to control the internet of the future, some say a kind of digital iron curtain is falling. On the one side, there's the US. On the other, there's China. Other countries are lining up too. This is also a battle about 5G or fifth generation wireless, the technology that increases the amount of data that can be transmitted wirelessly. The so-called Internet of Things could also combine things like artificial intelligence and virtual reality. The problem is politicians don't understand it and haven't got a clue how to regulate it or control it. There's even no clear consensus about its very definition. It's also worth remembering that the internet wasn't built by a government or a large company. The founding fathers were interested in things like providing a force for good. Well, joining me from London now is Adrian Lovett. Adrian is the Chief Executive Officer of the Web Foundation. The World Wide Web Foundation was established in 2009 by the inventor of the web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Good to have you with us. Are we seeing now a sort of global divide emerge around Chinese technology and whether you accept it, especially when it comes to things like 5G, or whether you oppose it?
I think there is a divide. And it's not a simple kind of black and white or sort of left and right split. There are arguably a number of internets emerging now. Wendy Hall from University of Southampton has done some great work on this, talking about how there is a sort of an original internet, if you like, that is based on openness and permissionless space, which is associated with the pioneers of the internet. There's, if you like, a European internet emerging, which has some of those features, but also elevates a focus on privacy and protection of individual citizens, perhaps at the cost of innovation. And there is, as you imply, a Chinese model, which is not only restricted to China, where the emphasis on surveillance and arguably social cohesion within that. Now, this is going to remain a complex picture, but I think that in the first two of those, at least, there are the seeds of a future internet that we can defend, that we can be proud of, that we can say is consistent with the founding vision of the web. But there's certainly work to do to achieve that.
So what does that divide ultimately mean for users? I guess your user experience will be very different depending on where you're logging in from, right?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, and of course, let's not forget that although we're reaching this point, in fact, just last month, that for the first time more than half the world is online, the first problem is the other half are not. So there's a real problem for the 3.5 billion people who don't have access to the internet at all. We have to work on that. But for those who do, you're absolutely right. There's a whole range of different experiences. Some research that we did in 65 countries recently found that more than half those countries don't have pretty basic data protection for their citizens.
What progress has been made in the sort of pushback against some of these tech giants having too much influence?
Well, I think, the example in Europe of the General Data Protection Register, the GDPR as it's called, that came in last year, is an example where actually there's what is largely seen now as a pretty sensible and moderate piece of legislation. It's very expansive, but it's moderate, and which initially companies were saying, well, we can't work with that, and I think most of them have found that actually they can and they should. And indeed are applying the kind of standards that are now required in Europe to, in many cases, to their users in other parts of the world. So I think there has been a shift in the direction of travel in the last year or so. I think there's further to go on that, but we are seeing progress. And I think actually the other aspect to consider is people who work in these big companies, whether they're at senior levels or the rank and file, programmers, engineers, and so on, many of those people actually are very concerned that their own companies do better, and they're calling on their own companies to do better. So that's a very powerful voice from within the industry as well.
Talking about a shift, how crucial is the issue of 5G data going to be, and the question of who controls it?
Well, it's hugely important in one respect. Control of it is key, and we're going to need the same kind of approach that was applied in the founding years of the web to ensure that there is an approach that is open, that is distributed and decentralized, to ensure that those safeguards are there. But I think it's also important to remember that, you know, as I said earlier, for half the world, 5G is a pipe dream. For half the world, you know, while some people are worrying about getting into their driverless cars in the next few years, half the world is yet to send its first email. So I think it's important that we keep this in proportion. The web and the internet were intended to be for everyone, and if you're in a decreasing minority of your fellow citizens who are not connected when most of them are, then you're missing out on some pretty fundamental things, like being able to access some healthcare services and to vote and to participate in public life in various ways. So, you know, those kind of challenges are not, 5G is not the solution to those. 5G will happen, it needs to happen in the right way, but we also need just as much energy behind ensuring that everybody gets connected, including the hardest to reach, including women who are less likely to be connected than men and less likely to be active online, and including rural areas as well as urban in different parts of the world. So there's a real job to do there, especially focusing on getting everybody connected to the web.
All right, thanks for your thoughts on that. Adrian Lovett.
Thank you.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, the Pacific island nation that's looking at legal action against big polluters thousands of kilometers away. But first, ahead of presidential elections in Senegal later this month, the country's 74-year-old currency has become a focus of debate. It's called the West African CFA franc. A problem for some, it's viewed as a legacy of colonialism. Nicholas Huck has more from Dakar in Senegal.
Just enough until next month. Awadjan is calling her younger brother Ndiaye to thank him for the money he sent. He's now in France, having left his life in Dakar for a better one in Europe. He tells her it's not what he expected, but he's still able to send a few €100 every month to his sister to look after the family.
It's not easy, but without him we couldn't make ends meet. There's no work for him here. We need him there. He's doing this for the money.
In January, Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio accused France of fueling the migrant crisis by controlling the economies of former African colonies through the local currency, the CFA.
France is one of those countries that by printing money for 14 African states prevents their economic development and contributes to the fact that the refugees leave and then die in the sea or arrive on our coasts.
I didn't like the comment from the Italian foreign minister. I found it very patronizing. Africa doesn't need any foreign minister than our own to speak on our behalf.
The comment came days before the start of the presidential campaign in Senegal, and the CFA is now part of the debate, with each candidate taking positions on the matter, some arguing for it, others against it, like Idrissa Seck, who asks why should white people in Paris take decisions on their currency. The Central African franc, or the CFA, has a fixed exchange rate with the euro, so Europeans can bring euros to Africa and easily swap them for the CFA. But state regulators make it difficult for Africans to take CFA out of their country and swap them into euros. Under an arrangement dating back more than 70 years, France's central bank controls the treasury of all 14 countries, leaving these nations with a limited supply of liquidity.
This guarantees a certain level of stability to the currency, allowing Awadjan to shop at her favorite French supermarket. Because French companies profit from this arrangement. It allows them easy access to a growing market of over 100 million people. But there's also growing resentment towards this currency, not just here in Senegal, but throughout Francophone West Africa.
France, get out. A graffiti found in various avenues of the capital. Sanya is behind the messaging.
Nous militons pour We want a common currency, but for West African countries only, without France's involvement. Or why couldn't we have our own currency like Morocco and Algeria? They are doing much better than us.
France is so far, yet so close. While money travels more freely than people, Europe continues to attract young African men. For Jan's family, the journey is worth the risk.
One area which desperately needs aid is Venezuela's crumbling public health system. In the coastal city of Barcelona, 14 children have died this week alone from contaminated food or water. Hospital workers say there's a dire need for medicine. Teresa Bow has this exclusive report.
This is the pediatrics emergency room at the Luis Racetti Hospital in the Venezuelan city of Barcelona, about 300 kilometers east of Caracas. Here, dozens of children are in desperate need of proper treatment. Most of them have been diagnosed with amoebiasis, a form of dysentery transmitted by contaminated food or water. Lady Chacon's daughter, Briani, is 3 months old. She suffers while her mother says she has been abandoned.
My daughter has diarrhea. She almost had a heart attack. We have nothing. You arrive here and there is nothing. I was in a crisis because I thought I was losing her. Children here have diarrhea with blood in it and they are vomiting, but nobody is helping us. I want this government out now. It has destroyed us.
We were allowed to film because staff here say they want the world to see that they are unequipped to save children's lives. Just this week, 14 children have died. The figures could climb.
You can see how desperate the situation is here. There's several children on each one of these beds. People are telling us that there's no medicines, that there are not enough syringes, among other things. Many of the children that are arriving here are dying from one day to another.
Marlene Mariño's baby boy was one of them. He was 2 months old. On Tuesday night, he died. His body remains in the hospital because she hasn't been able to get together the money needed to buy a coffin.
There is nothing here. They have no medicines. They don't have food, and now my son is dead.
People in Barcelona believe the outbreak was caused when a sewage pipe broke and contaminated the local water supply. There was no chlorine or other chemicals in supply to treat the water. Parents with their children continue to line up for treatment. Staff at the hospital say they don't have the resources to help.
3 years ago, we stopped receiving gauze and alcohol. There are not enough syringes or serums to hydrate children.
The government of President Nicolás Maduro denies there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. However, he recently announced he is reforming the country's healthcare system.
This is a public company recovered by the revolution. Venezuela is going to produce all the medicines it needs for its public healthcare system. In social security, we can reach everyone like it should be in socialism.
The situation in the Luis Racetti Hospital is one of the reasons why the self-declared interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaidó, says humanitarian aid is urgently needed. But some aid officials advise if it does arrive, it needs to be carefully managed.
Humanitarian aid is a mechanism that every country has. It's a mistake to make politics out of this. There are great needs in Venezuela, and it has to be controlled, managed by the United Nations and other agencies, so it reaches those who need it.
A crisis that has people at this hospital watching and hoping that their children will survive.
Teresa Bow reporting there, and those are the harrowing scenes across the country, a health service deprived of resources over the last 5 years. Now, one of the main sources of money for Venezuela currently is an asset that lies outside of the country and is itself the center of an international tug-of-war. Venezuela's cash cow, which generates most of its foreign currency earnings, is a refinery called Citgo. It's based in the US, and there's a big fight brewing over who controls it in the future. Russia's Rosneft owns 49.9% of Citgo through a $1.5 billion collateralized loan. The rest is owned by Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. The cash it generates is crucial to Maduro and opposition leader Juan Guaidó, who wants to replace the board. Well, the US decision to sanction Venezuelans' oil assets 2 weeks ago was a move designed to keep Citgo revenues out of President Nicolas Maduro's hands. This was his response at the time.
The United States today decided to take the path to steal Citgo from Venezuela, and that's an illegal path. I gave instructions to the president of PDVSA, owner of Citgo, to start with political and legal actions in the American courts and around the world to defend the property and the riches of Citgo.
Well, joining me now from London is Dara McDowell. Dara is the head of Europe research and principal analyst on Russia at the risk analysis company Verisk Maplecroft. Good to have you with us. Let's talk a little bit about Citgo, because that's a major earner, of course, for the country. If the US is successful in supporting Guaido's attempt to try and take over the management board of Citgo, what happens to the money? Does that mean that Guaido will have the power to distribute the oil revenues to the people? Because he's in a bit of a bind, isn't he, himself?
One of the issues surrounding that is that we have had quite a bit of Russian investment within Venezuela during the Chavez and Maduro presidencies. And so there will be a question as to what claims Russia is making, what role it's going to play, and how receptive all the other players in Venezuela are to Moscow's claims in that sense.
I'm glad you mentioned Russia's investments in Venezuela. More broadly, of course, Russia has an interest in PDVSA and in Citgo through collateralized debt. How much of a card, then, does Russia have to play in the struggle over the management board of Citgo?
Naturally, of course, that if there is a change of leadership in Venezuela and Guaido takes over, there'll be potentially some sort of claim to dismiss a lot of the obligations made under Chavez and Maduro as illegitimate or odious debts or this sort of thing. Russia will naturally fight that legally. Again, the question of which claim will actually out in the end is something that'll take a long time to resolve through international institutions. But this shows the kind of spoiler role that Russia can play in the country at the moment. It certainly doesn't really have the heft or the resources to save Maduro at the moment or to really stabilize the situation in Venezuela. But it has enough of an interest that it can make any sort of transition difficult. And that's the card that Moscow is probably looking to play over the coming weeks and days.
I guess who plays the spoiler role is a matter of perspective, depending on whose side you're on and seeing which administration right now is legitimate. But could the ownership of Citgo ultimately turn into a legal tussle, especially if Russia feels, hey, our debts are not being paid back properly?
Of course, and that's something about why we see the limited Russian presence in Caracas at the moment, why we've seen things like Wagner private military contractors on the ground, why we're seeing this rhetoric from the Kremlin about the sovereignty of Venezuela and not wanting to back any sort of regime change. Now, part of that is due to traditional Russian foreign policy goals anyway. They don't necessarily like to see autocratic countries coming under threat from below. But secondly, it's a signal to the US and to the EU and to other powers that that Russia does have interests in Venezuela, that they should be respected or at least compensated for somehow, or otherwise Moscow can look at these legal options, these other mechanisms for ensuring that even if there is a transition, that it's an extremely difficult one, and that they begin presenting obstacles to Caracas rather than welcoming any sort of new administration.
Why does Russia loan money to what some regard as risky bets?
Well, there's two factors to this. Part of this is due to the internal politics of the Kremlin and the various players within there, some of whom might believe that there is some sort of genuine advantage to this. But generally speaking, it's a way for Russia to present itself as a superpower on the cheap. While these loans aren't insignificant, in the grand scheme of things, they aren't going to bankrupt Russia if there is some sort of default. However, by making them and by positioning itself as an ally to this country on the other side of the world. It can, keep on some of the superpower trappings of the old Soviet days, pretend, it's still a global power rather than a regional one, and to do so without risking too much.
Do you read into some of the recent statements by some Russian officials about how the two sides in Venezuela really have to talk to each other? Any signal at all that perhaps Russia is kind of reviewing its stance to make sure it's not putting all of its weight behind one side that might ultimately lose?
And this goes back to, there are investments there. Russia does have interest in Venezuela. And after an initial, strong backing of Maduro, or at least making the rhetorical noises that the Russian Foreign Ministry felt that it had to make, now there's a point of like, well, there's no point in sending additional good money after bad. There's no way that we can really save this regime at a cost acceptable to ourselves. So it's time to start getting ourselves on the, to start making ourselves a part of the dialogue, and to make sure that if we see some sort of transition in Venezuela, that Russia has a seat at the table. And that's what these investments are about at the present, using that leverage to make sure that the Kremlin has, if not a decisive say, then at least some input into what happens next in Caracas.
All right, thanks for your analysis. Darren McDowell there.
Thank you.
And finally, for the people of Vanuatu, rising sea temperatures, intense cyclones and erratic weather patterns are becoming a part of daily life, where they're being forced to spend more money, not only on protecting themselves, but also on keeping their businesses afloat. And now Vanuatu is considering legal action against big polluters thousands of kilometres away, as Andrew Thomas reports.
Warming seas mean fewer fish in the waters around Vanuatu. So people are building fish farms inland instead.
It is very frustrating. Cost to build one fish farm is around $15,000 US.
There are other costs of climate change here. More frequent cyclones mean big repair bills. Mitigation in preparation for disasters and rising sea levels also have big costs. Vanuatu's own contribution to global climate change is small. Even so, it's doing all it can to reduce it further. There are solar farms and coconut plantations. Oil squeezed from coconuts can fuel generators as a clean way to make electricity.
One coconut will give you 0.1 liter of oil, and with what we've got here, it's half an hour of a TV program.
But a few coconut-powered televisions will make little difference to the global climate. Vanuatu's government believes the world's big polluters should compensate it for the damage that climate change does here, and that if they won't voluntarily through treaties and agreements, then they'll try to force them to through the threat of legal action. The government is considering suing big polluting countries and fossil fuel companies.
We're working with a number of lawyers in different parts of the world. We're also looking at our evidence base that we're going to need to prove in court.
That would be hard. Suing a company needs to happen in that company's national courts, giving them the home advantage. Taking legal action against a country means going to the International Court of Justice. It only considers cases where the country being sued agrees to the case being heard.
But there is another avenue that Vanuatu can take, and that is to ask the ICJ for an advisory opinion. And that isn't legally binding, but it does set the direction, and it gives the world a sense of exactly how the ICJ sees the legal issues.
Vanuatu's leaders hope the possibility that countries or companies might have to pay compensation one day will increase their potential financial liabilities now, scaring off investors unless they take action to minimise those risks. So though legal action is the threat, Vanuatu would rather settle out of court.
And that's our show for this week, but remember you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.